When my parents disowned me over politics and blocked my number, I thought that was the end of our relationship. I was wrong. 3 months later, their insurance company called me at 2 a.m. asking if I wanted to be taken off as their emergency contact. I said no, keep me on there. 24 hours later, I got another call that changed everything. The call came during my lunch break at the accounting firm where I work as a senior tax consultant. I was eating a sad desk salad when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Usually I let unknown numbers go to voicemail, but something about the timing felt urgent. The woman on the other end spoke with that careful professional tone that medical professionals use when they're about to deliver news you don't want to hear. "Is this Sarah Chen?" she asked. "Yes, this is Sarah. My name is Dr. Martinez from St. Mary's Hospital. Your parents, Robert and Linda Chen, were brought to our emergency department this morning following a serious car accident. You're listed as their primary emergency contact." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the edge of my desk, my salad forgotten. "Are they okay? What happened?" "They're both in critical condition. Your father has severe internal injuries and your mother sustained significant trauma. We need you here as soon as possible to discuss treatment options and make some important decisions." I was already grabbing my purse, my mind racing. "I'll be right there." "Which hospital?" She gave me the address and I was out the door before she finished speaking. The drive to the hospital felt like it took forever and no time at all. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I tried to process what was happening. 3 months ago, my parents had told me I was dead to them. They'd said I was a disgrace to the family name, that they couldn't have raised someone so morally corrupt. All because I'd voted differently than them in the last election. The fight had been building for years. Really. What started as minor political disagreements during family dinners had grown into something much bigger and uglier. My parents, Robert and Linda, had always been conservative, but over the past few years, they'd become increasingly radical in their views. Every conversation somehow turned into a political argument. Every family gathering became a minefield of topics I had to carefully avoid. I'm 32 years old, and I've always prided myself on being independent. I have my own apartment, a good career, and I've worked hard to build a life I'm proud of. But somehow my parents made me feel like I was still a disappointment of a teenager every time I walked into their house. It didn't matter that I'd graduated summa cum laude from college, that I'd built a successful career in a competitive field, or that I volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends. None of that seemed to matter when politics came up. The breaking point happened on a Sunday in November, just 2 days after the election. I'd gone over to their house for our usual family dinner, hoping we could just avoid talking about the results and have a normal meal together. My younger brother Mike was there too, and things seemed fine at first. Mom had made her famous pot roast, and Dad was in a good mood, talking about his retirement plans from his job at the Postal Service. Then Mike brought up something he'd seen on the news, and within minutes we were in a full-blown argument about voter fraud conspiracies and election integrity. I tried to stay calm, to present facts and evidence, but they weren't interested in hearing any perspective that didn't align with theirs. When I mentioned that I'd voted for the Democratic candidate, the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. "How could you?" Mom asked, her voice breaking. "After everything we taught you about right and wrong." "Mom, we can have different political opinions and still love each other," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This doesn't have to change our relationship." But Dad was already shaking his head. "It changes everything, Sarah. You've chosen your side, and it's not ours. I don't know how we raised someone who could support people who want to destroy this country." "Dad, that's not fair. I'm not trying to destroy anything. I just have different ideas about how to solve problems." "Different ideas?" He stood up from the table, his face red with anger. "You voted for people who want to take away our freedoms, who want to indoctrinate children, who hate America. Those aren't just different ideas, Sarah, that's evil." The conversation spiraled from there. Mike tried to play peacekeeper, but it was too late. Things were said that couldn't be taken back. Mom cried and said she felt like she'd failed as a mother. Dad accused me of being brainwashed by liberal propaganda. I tried to explain my positions, tried to find common ground, but they weren't listening anymore. Finally, Dad looked at me with cold eyes and said, "If you can live with yourself supporting those people, then you're not the daughter we raised. As far as we're concerned, you're dead to us." Mom didn't contradict him, she just kept crying and shaking her head. I left that night, knowing something fundamental had broken between us. I thought maybe they'd cool off, that we'd find a way to repair things eventually. I sent them a text message a few days later apologizing for the argument and suggesting we focus on family instead of politics. The message bounced back, they'd blocked my number. I tried calling from a work phone a week late. Mom answered, and when she realized it was me, she hung up immediately. I sent a letter to their house, asking if we could talk, if we could find a way past this. It came back unopened, marked return to sender. Mike became the go-between for a while. He'd give me updates on how they were doing, and he tried to mediate, but it was clear they weren't interested in reconciliation. According to him, they'd told extended family that I'd chosen politics over family, and that they were mourning me as if I'd actually died. Some relatives reached out to me with sympathy, but others seemed to take their side, believing whatever version of events my parents had shared. The holidays were the hardest part. Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been big family affairs at my parents' house, with aunts and uncles and cousins all gathering together. This year, I spent them alone in my apartment, ordering takeout and trying not to think about the empty chair at their dinner table where I used to sit. I threw myself into work to distract from the pain. I took on extra clients, stayed late at the office, and volunteered for every project that came up. My colleagues probably thought I was gunning for a promotion, but really I was just trying to keep busy enough that I didn't have time to think about the hole in my life where my family used to be. The irony wasn't lost on me that despite everything, I was still listed as their emergency contact. When the insurance company had called me a few weeks earlier asking if I wanted to be removed from their policy, I'd said no without really thinking about it. Some part of me still hoped things would get better, that time would heal the wounds we'd inflicted on each other. Now, as I pulled into the hospital parking lot, I realized just how naive that hope had been. I was about to walk into a situation where I was simultaneously the person they'd disowned and the person they most needed. I had no idea what I was going to find when I got inside, or how they'd react to seeing me there. The emergency department was busy, with people in scrubs hurrying back and forth, and the constant beeping of medical equipment providing a soundtrack to barely controlled chaos. I approached the nurse's station and identified myself, and within minutes Dr. Martinez appeared. She was a small woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail, the kind of person who radiated competence and compassion in equal measure. "Miss Chen, thank you for coming so quickly," she said, leading me to a quiet corner where we could talk. "I need to prepare you for what you're about to see. Your parents were involved in a head-on collision with a drunk driver this morning. The other driver was killed instantly. Your father has internal bleeding and several broken ribs, and we're monitoring him closely for signs of brain injury. Your mother has a collapsed lung, a broken pelvis, and she's currently unconscious." I felt like I was hearing her words from underwater. "Are they going to be okay?" "It's too early to say for certain," she said gently. "The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical. We're doing everything we can, but I want you to understand that their conditions are serious. There may be some difficult decisions ahead." She led me through a maze of hallways to the intensive care unit. The ICU was quieter than the emergency department, but somehow more intense. Machines hummed and beeped, and nurses moved with purposeful efficiency between rooms. Dr. Martinez stopped in front of room 314. "Your father is in here," she said. "He's sedated right now, but he may be able to hear you. We'll let you see your mother in a few minutes once the respiratory therapist is finished with her." I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Dad looked so small in the hospital bed, surrounded by tubes and wires and monitors that tracked his every vital sign. His face was bruised and swollen, and there was a breathing tube down his throat. He'd lost weight since I'd seen him last, I realized, and his hair had gotten grayer. He looked older, more fragile than the strong, stubborn man who'd raised me. I pulled a chair up next to his bed and sat down, not sure what to say. The last words we'd spoken to each other had been angry ones. He'd told me I was dead to him, and I'd left his house thinking I might never see him again. Now here he was, fighting for his life, and I was the only family member the hospital could reach. "Hi, Dad," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's Sarah, I'm here." The machines kept beeping their steady rhythm. His chest rose and fell with the mechanical assistance of the ventilator. I reached out and touched his hand, surprised by how cold it felt. "I know we haven't talked in a while," I continued, feeling foolish for talking to someone who couldn't respond. "I know you're mad at me, but I'm here now, okay? Mike is driving up from Portland and he'll be here soon. We're going to take care of everything." I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, watching him breathe and listening to the sounds of the hospital around us. Nurses came and went, checking his IV and adjusting settings on various machines. They were all kind to me, treating me like any other worried daughter, not knowing about the complicated history that had brought me to this bedside. Dr. Martinez returned and took me to see Mom. If Dad had looked small and fragile, Mom looked practically broken. Her leg was in traction, and the right side of her face was covered in bandages. She had her own collection of tubes and monitors, and the steady hiss of oxygen being delivered through a mask made her sound like she was breathing through water. "The brain activity looks good," Dr. Martinez explained, pointing to one of the monitors. "We're optimistic that she'll regain consciousness, but with head injuries, there's always some uncertainty about potential cognitive effects." I took Mom's hand, which was warmer than Dad's had been, but still didn't feel quite right. Her wedding ring was loose on her finger, another sign that she'd lost weight. They both had, I realized. I wondered if they'd been eating properly, if they'd been taking care of themselves. They were both in their early 60s, not old by any means, but not young enough to bounce back from something like this easily either. "Mom, it's Sarah," I said, squeezing her hand gently. "You're in the hospital, but you're going to be okay. The doctors are taking good care of you." A nurse named Jennifer showed me to a family waiting area where I could settle in. It was a small room with uncomfortable chairs, a coffee machine that probably hadn't been cleaned in months, and a television playing some mindless daytime talk show with the sound turned down. She brought me forms to fill out, insurance information to verify, and a plastic bag containing my parents' personal effects from the accident scene. Going through their belongings felt like an invasion of privacy, but it was necessary. Dad's wallet contained his driver's license, insurance cards, and exactly $43 in cash. Mom's purse held her usual collection of receipts, coupons, and photographs. There was a picture of Mike's kids that looked recent, and an older photo of the three of us from my college graduation. I was surprised she still carried it. The most surprising thing was a folded piece of paper tucked behind Mom's insurance card. When I unfolded it, I recognized my handwriting immediately. It was a birthday card I'd given her 2 years ago, one of those sappy ones that talked about how grateful I was for everything she'd taught me and how much I loved her. She'd kept it in her wallet all this time, even after disowning me. I had to step outside for a moment after that discovery. The hallway felt too bright and too loud, and I needed air that didn't smell like disinfectant and fear. I found a quiet corner near a window and called my boss to let her know I wouldn't be back in the office that day, possibly not for several days. She was understanding and told me to take whatever time I needed. Next, I called Mike. He was already on the road, driving the 4 hours from Portland, where he worked as a high school teacher. His voice was tight with worry, but he sounded relieved that I was there. "How bad is it really?" he asked. "Bad," I said honestly. "They're both in intensive care. The doctor says the next couple of days are critical." "I can't believe this is happening," he said. "I just talked to Dad last week. He seemed fine." "Mike," I said carefully, "they put me down as their emergency contact. Does that seem weird to you?" There was a long pause. "Not really," he said finally. "You're the oldest and you work in finance, so you understand all the insurance and medical stuff better than I do. Plus you live closer to them." "But they disowned me," I reminded him. "They told me I was dead to them." Another pause. "Look, Sarah, I know things have been complicated lately, but you're still family. That doesn't just go away because you disagree about politics." I wanted to tell him that it had felt pretty final to me when they blocked my phone number and returned my letters unopened. But he was dealing with his own worry and fear about our parents, and this didn't seem like the time to relitigate old grievances. "I'll be there in about 3 hours," he said. "Can you handle things until then?" "Of course," I said, though I wasn't sure what handling things actually entailed in this situation. I went back to the waiting area and tried to make sense of all the paperwork the hospital had given me.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
There were consent forms for various procedures, insurance authorizations, and informational pamphlets about traumatic brain injuries and internal bleeding. The medical terminology was intimidating, but I did my best to understand what the doctors were telling me about my parents' conditions. Around 4 in the afternoon, Dr. Martinez found me again. "Your father is showing some signs of improvement," she said. "His blood pressure has stabilized, and we're optimistic about reducing some of the sedation tonight to see how he responds." "What about Mom?" "Still unconscious, but her vital signs are stable. Sometimes with head injuries, the brain needs time to heal itself. We're being patient and monitoring her closely." "Is there anything I can do?" I asked. "Anything that would help them?" "Be here," she said simply. "Talk to them. Hold their hands. Sometimes the presence of family makes more difference than you might think." I spent the rest of the afternoon going back and forth between their rooms. I talked to Dad about work, about the weather, about anything I could think of that wasn't political. I told him about the promotion I'd gotten at the firm, about the new apartment complex being built next to mine, about the cat I was thinking of adopting from the shelter. Stupid mundane things that might have bored him under normal circumstances, but that felt important now. With Mom, I found myself sharing memories. I reminded her of the time she taught me to make her chocolate chip cookies and how I'd gotten flour all over the kitchen and she'd laughed instead of getting angry. I talked about the camping trips we used to take when Mike and I were kids, and how she'd always pack way too much food and make us eat sandwiches for days afterward. I told her about the bedtime stories she used to read to me and how she'd do different voices for all the characters. The funny thing was, talking to them like this reminded me of who they'd been before politics took over our relationship. They weren't just the angry, hurt people who'd disowned me 3 months ago. They were the parents who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd sat through every school play I'd ever been in, who'd helped me move into my first apartment after college. They were complicated people with their own fears and beliefs, not just the political caricatures they'd become in my mind. Mike arrived around 7 that evening, looking tired and worried. He hugged me tightly in the waiting room, and for a moment we were just two scared kids whose parents were hurt and in the hospital. "Any change?" he asked. "Dad might be improving a little," I said. "The doctor wants to try reducing his sedation tonight. Mom is stable but still unconscious." We went to see them together. Mike was clearly shaken by how bad they looked, but he pulled himself together and started talking to them the same way I had been doing. It felt good not to be alone with this anymore. "I can't believe they called you first," he said, as we sat in the waiting room later that evening. "Why?" "Because of everything that happened. The fight, them blocking your number. I figured they would have changed their emergency contact information." I showed him the birthday card I'd found in Mom's wallet. He read it and looked up at me with surprise. "She kept this for 2 years apparently, even after telling me I was dead to her." Mike was quiet for a long time. "You know," he said finally, "I don't think they ever really meant that. They blocked my number, Mike. They returned my letter unopened. That seemed pretty final to me." I know, but you don't understand what they were like after you left that night." Mom cried for weeks. Dad pretended to be angry, but I caught him looking through photo albums of you as a kid. "They were hurt and stubborn, but I don't think they actually wanted to lose you forever." "Then why didn't they reach out? Why didn't they try to fix things?" "Same reason you didn't. Probably. Pride, stubbornness, fear of being rejected." It was a painful thought that we'd all been waiting for someone else to make the first move while 3 months of silence stretched between us. Now my parents were fighting for their lives, and all those political arguments that had seemed so important suddenly felt trivial and stupid. A nurse came to update us around 10. Dad was responding well to the reduced sedation and might be conscious enough to communicate tomorrow. Mom's condition was unchanged but stable. We could stay overnight if we wanted to, sleeping in the waiting room, or we could go home and come back in the morning. "I'm staying," I said immediately. Mike nodded. Me too. We sent out for pizza and settled in for what would probably be a long, uncomfortable night. The waiting room never really got quiet, with nurses and doctors coming and going, phones ringing, and the general hum of a hospital that never sleeps. We took turns checking on our parents and trying to get some rest on chairs that seemed designed to prevent anyone from actually sleeping. Around 3 in the morning, I was dozing fitfully when a nurse shook me gently awake. "Miss Chen, your father is asking for you." My heart was pounding as I followed the nurse down the dimly lit hallway. Dad was awake. After nearly 18 hours of unconsciousness, he was finally awake and asking for me. I had no idea what to expect. Would he be angry to see me? Would he remember our fight? Would he even remember who I was after the head trauma? The nurse, whose name tag read Patricia, walked beside me with quiet efficiency. "He's still quite groggy from the medications," she explained softly. "The breathing tube was removed about an hour ago, but his voice will be hoarse. Don't expect long conversations just yet." I nodded, trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to face. Through the small window in his door, I could see Dad propped up slightly in bed, his eyes open but unfocused. The harsh fluorescent lighting made his bruises look worse than they had earlier, purple and yellow splotches covering the left side of his face. "Dad," I said quietly as I entered the room. His eyes found mine immediately, and for a moment we just stared at each other. I searched his face for anger, for rejection, for any sign of the man who had told me I was dead to him. Instead, I saw confusion, pain, and something that looked almost like relief. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You came." "Of course I came, Dad. I'm your emergency contact. Remember?" He tried to shift position and winced. "Hurts," he said simply. I moved closer to his bed, still uncertain about how much physical affection would be welcome. "I know. The doctors say you're going to be okay, but it's going to take time. Your mother," the question came out as more of a croak. "She's stable, still unconscious, but the doctors are optimistic. Mike is here too. He drove down from Portland." Dad closed his eyes for a moment, and I thought he might have drifted back to sleep. But then he opened them again and looked directly at me. "I don't remember much," he said. "The accident, but I remember you being here earlier, talking to me. You could hear me, some of it, about your job. The apartment." He paused, breathing carefully. "About the cookies." I felt tears threatening. "I wasn't sure if you'd want me here, after everything that happened." Dad was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep again. When he finally spoke, his voice was even quieter than before. "I said things, terrible things. We both said things, Dad." "No." He shook his head slightly, then grimaced at the movement. "What I said was wrong. You're my daughter. Nothing changes that." I had to sit down. In all my imaginings of this moment, I hadn't expected this. I'd prepared myself for continued anger, for him to ask me to leave, for him to maintain the wall that had been built between us. I hadn't prepared myself for an apology. "I've missed you," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "Missed you too," he whispered. "Every day." We talked for a few more minutes, but he was clearly exhausted. The nurse came back and suggested he try to get some rest. Before I left, Dad reached out and took my hand. "Don't leave," he said. "Don't go home. Stay here." "I'm not going anywhere, Dad. I'll be right down the hall." I found Mike in the waiting area, stretched out across 3 chairs and snoring softly. I didn't wake him. Instead, I went to check on Mom. She looked exactly the same as she had hours earlier, breathing steadily with the help of the oxygen mask, monitors tracking her vital signs in their endless electronic rhythm. "Hi, Mom," I said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Dad's awake. He's asking about you. He's going to be okay, and so are you." I stayed with her until sunrise, talking quietly about nothing and everything. I told her about Dad being awake, about how sorry he seemed about our fight. I told her about work projects, about books I'd been reading, about a documentary I'd watched about penguins. Stupid things, but they felt important in the quiet of the ICU. Mike found me there around 7 in the morning, looking rumpled and concerned. "How's Dad?" he asked. "Better." He was awake for about 20 minutes around 3. He seems clear mentally, just very tired and in a lot of pain. Did you guys talk about the fight? I nodded. He apologized, said he was wrong. Mike looked surprised. Really, Dad doesn't apologize for anything. I know, it was unexpected. We grabbed terrible hospital coffee and stale pastries from the cafeteria and ate breakfast in Mom's room. Mike talked to her about his kids, about the school year starting soon, about a fishing trip he was planning with some friends. Normal family conversation, the kind we used to have before politics poisoned everything. Dr. Martinez appeared around 9, with the morning update. Dad was doing well enough that they might move him out of the ICU later in the day. Mom's brain activity continued to look good, but she remained unconscious. They were going to do another CT scan to check for any changes. How long could she stay unconscious? I asked. It varies, Dr. Martinez said. Sometimes it's hours, sometimes days. Occasionally weeks. The brain heals at its own pace. The thought of Mom being unconscious for weeks was terrifying. I tried not to let my imagination run wild with worst-case scenarios, but it was hard not to think about what would happen if she never woke up, or if she woke up but wasn't the same person. Mike had to drive back to Portland that afternoon to handle some work obligations, but he promised to return by the weekend. I took a leave of absence from my job, something I'd never done in my entire career. My boss was understanding, but I could hear the stress in her voice, as she tried to figure out how to cover my client load. Dad was moved to a regular room on Wednesday morning, which felt like a huge milestone. He was sitting up in bed when I arrived, looking more alert than he had since the accident. The bruising on his face was starting to fade from purple to yellow, and though he was still obviously in pain, he seemed more like himself. You look better, I said, settling into the visitor's chair. Feel better, still hurt like hell, but better. The doctor says you might be able to go home next week, if everything continues to improve. Dad nodded, then looked uncomfortable. Sarah, we need to talk about what happened between us.
Dad, you don't have to do this now. You should focus on getting better. No, I do have to do this. I've been lying here thinking about it for the past 2 days. He shifted position carefully. What I said to you was unforgivable. You're my daughter, and I love you, and nothing should ever change that. I said things too. I was angry and hurt, and I probably said things I shouldn't have. You were defending your beliefs. I was attacking you as a person. There's a difference. He was right, and we both knew it. The fight hadn't been about policy differences or political philosophy. It had become personal, with character attacks and accusations that went far beyond the ballot box. I don't understand how we got here, I said. When did politics become more important than family? Dad was quiet for a long time. I think it happened gradually, he said finally. I got scared. The world was changing so fast, and I didn't understand a lot of what was happening. The news made everything sound like an emergency, like the country was falling apart, and when you disagreed with me, it felt like you were saying I was stupid or wrong about everything. I never thought you were stupid, Dad. We just see things differently. I know that now, but at the time it felt like you were choosing strangers over family. Like the people you voted for were more important to you than your own parents. It was painful to hear, but I could understand how he might have felt that way. In my frustration with their increasingly extreme views, I had probably been condescending at times. I had rolled my eyes at their sources of information and dismissed their concerns without really listening. I'm sorry too, I said. I should have tried harder to understand where you were coming from, instead of just arguing with you. We were both wrong, Dad said. But I was more wrong. I'm your father. I should have protected our relationship instead of destroying it. We talked for another hour, really talked in a way we hadn't done in years. Not about politics, but about family, about love, about how easy it is to lose sight of what matters most when you're caught up in the anger and fear that seems to dominate everything these days. Your mom has been miserable, Dad said. She cried every day for the first month after you left. She kept saying she wanted to call you, but she was too proud and too scared you'd reject her. I sent a letter, I said. She returned it unopened. I made her do that. I thought if we held firm you'd come around and apologize. I thought you'd realize you were wrong and come back to us. He shook his head. I was an idiot. We were all idiots, Dad. That evening I was sitting with Mom when her breathing pattern changed. The change was subtle, but after days of listening to the steady rhythm of the ventilator, I noticed immediately. I called for a nurse, who took one look at the monitors and went to get Dr. Martinez. She's showing signs of regaining consciousness, the doctor explained. This is very encouraging. You should talk to her. Let her know you're here. I took Mom's hand and leaned closer to her bed. Mom, it's Sarah. I'm here with you. Dad is okay, and he's asking about you constantly. Mike was here yesterday, and he'll be back this weekend. We're all here for you. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly. She looked confused and disoriented, blinking rapidly in the harsh hospital lighting. When her eyes finally focused on my face, I saw a range of emotions cross her features: confusion, recognition, and then something that looked like shame. Sarah. Her voice was barely audible. I'm here, Mom. You're in the hospital. You were in a car accident, but you're going to be okay. She tried to sit up and immediately winced. Robert. Dad's fine. He's in another room, recovering. He's been asking about you non-stop. Tears started streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry about everything. Mom, don't worry about that now. Just focus on getting better. No, I have to say this. What we did was wrong. What I did was wrong. You're my daughter and I love you, and I should never have let politics come between us. I was crying too now. I love you too, Mom. I've missed you so much. The next few hours were a blur of medical tests and evaluations. Mom's cognitive function appeared to be intact, though she was weak and disoriented. The doctors were optimistic about her recovery, but warned that it would be a long process. Mike arrived that evening, and the reunion with Mom was even more emotional than mine had been. She clung to him and apologized over and over for the months of estrangement. Mike, who had always been the peacemaker in our family, just held her and told her everything was going to be okay. We spent the next few days at the hospital, taking turns sitting with our parents, and slowly rebuilding the relationships that had been damaged. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension when political topics came up accidentally, but we all made a conscious effort to focus on family instead of ideology. Dad was discharged on Friday, exactly 1 week after the accident. He was still in considerable pain and would need weeks of physical therapy, but he was stable enough to go home. Mom would need to stay in the hospital for at least another week, but her progress was encouraging. The drive to their house was awkward. I hadn't been there since the night of our big fight, and I wasn't sure how it would feel to walk through those doors again. Everything looked exactly the same as I remembered it, but somehow smaller and more familiar than it had seemed in my memory. Dad needed help getting up the stairs to his bedroom, and as I supported his weight, I was struck by how fragile he felt. He'd always seemed so strong and invincible to me, but the accident had reminded all of us how quickly things can change. Thank you, he said, as I helped him settle into bed, for everything, for coming to the hospital, for staying with us, for taking care of things. You don't have to thank me, Dad. You're my family. That evening, I was sitting in the living room looking through photo albums when I found pictures from my college graduation. There were dozens of them, my parents beaming with pride as I walked across the stage in my cap and gown. I remembered that day clearly. Dad had been so excited he'd embarrassed me by cheering loudly when my name was called. Mom had cried through the entire ceremony. Looking at those photos, it was hard to believe that these same people had disowned me just a few months later over something as temporary as an election. We'd let fear and anger override decades of love and shared history. I was still looking through the albums when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, thinking it might be someone from the hospital. Is this Sarah Chen? A man's voice asked. Yes, this is Sarah. My name is Detective Rodriguez, with the Metro Police Department. I'm investigating the accident involving your parents. I understand you've been handling their affairs while they recover. Yes, that's right. I have some questions about your parents' insurance coverage. Specifically their car insurance. Would it be possible to meet with you sometime this week? Something in his tone made me uncomfortable. What kind of questions? I'd rather discuss this in person if possible. Are you available tomorrow morning? I agreed to meet him at the police station, though I had no idea what he could want to know about my parents' insurance that wasn't already in the accident report. Dad had been driving when they were hit by the drunk driver, and as far as I knew, they weren't at fault for anything. The next morning, I left Dad with a neighbor who had volunteered to check on him periodically, and drove to the police station. Detective Rodriguez was a middle-aged Hispanic man with kind eyes and a serious demeanor. He led me to a small conference room and offered me coffee, which I declined. "Miss Chen, I want to be upfront with you. We're investigating possible insurance fraud related to your parents' policy." My stomach dropped. What kind of fraud? According to our investigation, your parents filed several claims over the past 2 years for accidents that may not have occurred the way they reported them. Small claims, nothing major, but the pattern is concerning. I felt like the floor was falling out from under me. Are you saying they staged accidents? I'm saying the evidence suggests some of their claims were exaggerated or fabricated. The insurance company has been investigating for months, and they contacted us when they saw the report from this accident. But this accident wasn't their fault. They were hit by a drunk driver. That's correct. This accident is legitimate. But it's drawn attention to their previous claims, and now the insurance company is questioning whether they should pay out for this one. The implications hit me all at once. My parents' medical bills were already astronomical, and they would only get higher as they continued treatment and rehabilitation. If the insurance company refused to pay, they would be financially ruined. What exactly are you alleging they did? I asked. Detective Rodriguez opened a file and showed me several photographs and police reports. 3 fender benders over the past 18 months. Each time, your parents claimed significant injury and property damage. But witness statements and physical evidence don't support their version of events. I studied the documents, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The accidents were all minor, the kind of things that usually result in exchanged insurance information, and maybe a small dent. But according to the claims, my parents had required medical treatment and their car had needed extensive repairs each time. I don't understand, I said. Why would they do this? Financial pressure usually. Your father retired last year, and their fixed income might not be covering their expenses. Small insurance payouts can seem like an easy way to supplement retirement income. I thought about Dad's retirement from the Postal Service, about the fixed pension and Social Security that probably didn't go as far as they'd hoped. I thought about the political arguments we'd had about government benefits and social safety nets, and how ironic it would be if they'd been committing fraud while lecturing me about personal responsibility. What happens now? I asked. The insurance company will make their own decision about coverage. Our investigation is ongoing, but given your parents' current medical situation, we're not rushing to file charges. However, if they were defrauding their insurance company, there will likely be criminal consequences eventually. I left the police station feeling sick. My parents were still recovering from a traumatic accident. We were just beginning to repair our relationship, and now I was learning that they might have been committing crimes. I didn't know what to think, or how to process this information. When I got back to their house, Dad was sitting in his recliner watching television. He looked up when I came in, and immediately seemed to sense that something was wrong. "Everything okay?" he asked. I sat down on the couch across from him, trying to figure out how to approach this conversation. "Dad, I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be honest with me." His expression grew wary. "What is it?" Detective Rodriguez called me. "He's investigating your insurance claims from the past couple of years." The color drained from Dad's face. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "Dad, how much do you know?" he asked quietly. "Enough to know that this is serious. They're talking about fraud charges." He put his head in his hands. "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to get dragged into this." "So it's true, you've been filing false insurance claims." "Not false, exactly. Exaggerated maybe. The accidents happened, but we might have made them sound worse than they were." "Dad, that's fraud. That's a crime. I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know how it sounds. But you don't understand the pressure we've been under. The mortgage, the medical bills, the
the cost of everything going up while our income stays the same. We were drowning, Sarah. I felt a mix of sympathy and anger. I understood financial pressure, but I couldn't understand how they'd justified breaking the law. Why didn't you ask for help? Mike and I both would have helped you. Your mother was too proud, and after our fight, we couldn't ask you for anything. We'd cut you out of our lives. How could we turn around and ask for money? The irony was devastating. They'd disowned me over political principles, but then compromised their own principles by committing fraud. They'd been too proud to ask their children for help, but not too proud to steal from an insurance company. Is this going to affect their coverage for the current accident? I asked. Dad nodded miserably. The insurance company is threatening to deny the claim. They're saying we violated the terms of our policy with the previous fraud. I calculated quickly in my head. The medical bills for both of them would easily exceed $100,000, possibly much more. Without insurance coverage, they would lose their house and everything they'd worked for their entire lives. How much money are we talking about from the false claims? Maybe $8,000 total, over 2 years. Small claims, but they add up. $8,000. They'd risked everything for $8,000, and now they might lose hundreds of thousands as a result. It was almost incomprehensible to me how short-sighted and destructive their choices had been. Dad, I don't know how to help you with this. I don't even know where to start. I don't expect you to help, he said. This is our mess. We'll figure it out. But even as he said it, we both knew they couldn't figure it out on their own. Dad was still recovering from serious injuries, Mom was still in the hospital, and they were facing potential criminal charges, along with financial ruin. They needed help, whether they wanted to admit it or not. That evening, I called Mike and explained the situation. He was as shocked as I had been, and we spent an hour on the phone trying to figure out what our options were. Maybe we need to hire a lawyer, Mike suggested. With what money? They're broke, and I can't afford to pay for a criminal defense attorney on my salary. What about the insurance company? Maybe we can negotiate with them somehow. It was a slim hope, but it was something. I spent the rest of the evening researching insurance fraud laws and trying to understand what my parents were facing. The more I learned, the worse it looked. Even if they avoided criminal charges, the insurance company could still refuse to pay their current claims, and they could be blacklisted from getting coverage elsewhere. The next morning, I drove to the hospital to see Mom. She was sitting up in bed, looking much better than she had since the accident. Her color was back, and though she was still weak, she seemed more like herself. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Better. The doctors say I might be able to go home next week." She paused. "How's your father?" I'd been dreading this conversation, but I knew I had to tell her about the insurance investigation. She deserved to know what they were facing. "Mom, we need to talk about something serious. The police called me yesterday." Her face went pale. "About what?" I explained everything Detective Rodriguez had told me, watching as Mom's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to shame. By the time I finished, she was crying again. "We never meant for it to go this far," she said. "It started small, with the first accident. We really were hurt, but maybe we exaggerated a little, to make sure the insurance covered everything. Then when money got tight, and there was another accident, we thought maybe we could do it again. Mom, this is fraud. This is serious. I know, we know, we've been sick about it for months, but we didn't know how to stop. Every time we got another check, we told ourselves it would be the last time." I sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed. "The insurance company might refuse to pay for your current medical bills because of this." "Oh God," she whispered. "Sarah, what are we going to do?" I didn't have an answer. I'd been asking myself the same question since my conversation with the detective, and I still didn't know what to tell her. I spent 3 sleepless nights researching insurance law and calling attorneys before I found someone willing to take on my parents' case. Margaret Walsh was a defense attorney who specialized in white-collar crime, and she agreed to meet with us for a consultation. The meeting took place in her downtown office, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture that made me acutely aware of how much this was going to cost. Dad had insisted on coming despite still being in considerable pain, and Mom had been discharged from the hospital just that morning. Let me be direct with you, Margaret said after reviewing the police reports and insurance documents. Your parents are looking at potential felony charges for insurance fraud. The amount involved pushes it beyond misdemeanor territory. Mom gripped Dad's hand tighter. What does that mean exactly? Prison time is possible, though unlikely for first-time offenders your age. More realistically, you're looking at hefty fines, restitution payments, and probation. But the immediate concern is the insurance company's threat to deny coverage for your accident claims. How much are we talking about? I asked. Margaret consulted her notes. Current medical bills are approaching $200,000, and that's just the beginning. Ongoing physical therapy, follow-up procedures, medication costs. You could be looking at $500,000 or more before this is over. The number hit me like a physical blow. $500,000. My parents' house wasn't worth that much, and even if they sold everything they owned, they'd never be able to cover those expenses. What are our options? Dad asked. We can try to negotiate with the insurance company. If your parents agree to plead guilty to the fraud charges and pay full restitution, the company might agree to honor the current claims. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible. How much restitution? I asked. The $8,000 they received in fraudulent payouts, plus penalties and interest. Probably around $15,000 total. Dad laughed bitterly. We don't have $15,000. If we had that kind of money, we wouldn't have been filing false claims in the first place. Margaret nodded sympathetically. That's where family often steps in. Daughter, son, relatives who can help cover the costs to avoid the larger catastrophe. All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of their expectations, their desperation, their need for me to somehow fix the mess they'd created. The irony wasn't lost on me that the daughter they'd disowned for political differences was now their only hope for financial salvation. I don't have $15,000 lying around, I said carefully. I could maybe come up with half of that, but it would wipe out my emergency savings. What about Mike? Mom asked. He's a high school teacher with 2 kids. He's not exactly rolling in money either. The room fell silent. Margaret cleared her throat and continued with the legal realities. There's another complication. Even if we can resolve the insurance issue, the criminal charges are still on the table. The district attorney's office has discretion about whether to prosecute, but given the pattern of behavior, they may decide to move forward regardless. Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself deeper in my parents' financial crisis than I'd ever imagined possible. I took extended leave from work and essentially moved back into my childhood bedroom to help coordinate their care and deal with the legal issues. The insurance company initially refused to negotiate, maintaining that fraud voided the entire policy. It took Margaret's persistent advocacy and the threat of a lengthy legal battle before they agreed to a settlement conference. Mike drove down from Portland for the meeting, and we all sat around a conference table with lawyers, insurance adjusters, and a mediator. The insurance company's position was clear. My parents had violated their contract through fraudulent claims, and the company had no obligation to pay for the current accident. Margaret argued that the current accident was entirely legitimate and unrelated to the previous claims. The drunk driver who hit them had been arrested and charged, and there was no question about liability. Denying coverage would be punishing my parents twice for the same crime. After 6 hours of negotiations, we reached an agreement. The insurance company would honor the current claims in full, but only if my parents pled guilty to the fraud charges, paid complete restitution, and agreed to have their policy canceled permanently. They would be reported to a national insurance fraud database, making it nearly impossible for them to get coverage from any other company. It's not a great deal, Margaret explained privately, but it's probably the best we're going to get. The financial reality was still daunting. Between restitution, legal fees, and the penalties, we needed to come up with nearly $30,000. Mike and I pooled our resources and managed to cover about half. The rest came from my parents agreeing to sell their house and downsize to a small apartment. Watching them pack up the home, where I'd grown up, was heartbreaking. Every box represented a piece of family history being discarded or donated.
Mom cried as she sorted through decades of photographs and keepsakes, deciding what was worth keeping in their new, much smaller living space. "I'm sorry we're losing the house," Dad said as we loaded boxes into a rental truck. "I know it was important to you and Mike. It's just a house, Dad. We'll make new memories." But it wasn't just a house, and we both knew it. It was the place where I'd celebrated every birthday, every Christmas, every major milestone of my childhood. It was where we'd gathered for family dinners and holiday celebrations. Now it was being sold to pay for their mistakes. The criminal case moved forward simultaneously with the insurance settlement. The district attorney agreed to reduce charges in exchange for guilty pleas and cooperation. Instead of felony fraud, my parents pled guilty to misdemeanor charges that would result in probation and community service, rather than jail time. The day they appeared in court was one of the most difficult of my life. Watching my parents stand before a judge and admit to crimes they'd committed was surreal and shameful. But it was also necessary, and I was proud of them for taking responsibility rather than continuing to deny what they'd done. Judge Martinez, coincidentally sharing a name with the doctor who'd treated them, was stern but fair. She sentenced them to 2 years of probation, 300 hours of community service, and ordered them to attend financial counseling classes. "I understand that you were under financial pressure," she said during sentencing, "but that doesn't excuse breaking the law. Insurance fraud affects everyone through higher premiums and reduced coverage options. You're fortunate that your current situation allows for rehabilitation rather than incarceration." Through all of this legal and financial chaos, something unexpected happened. My parents and I grew closer than we'd been in years. Working together to solve their crisis forced us to communicate constantly, to rely on each other, and to focus on practical problems, rather than ideological differences. We still disagreed about politics, but we'd learned to avoid those topics and concentrate on family instead. Dad started asking about my work not to criticize my career choices, but because he was genuinely interested in what I did. Mom began sharing stories about their financial struggles, not to justify their fraud, but to help me understand the pressure they'd been under. The insurance company made good on their agreement and paid the medical bills in full. Both of my parents recovered well from their injuries, though Dad still walked with a slight limp, and Mom tired more easily than she used to. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment across town and slowly began rebuilding their lives. 6 months after the accident, we established a new family tradition. Every Sunday, we met for dinner at a neutral restaurant, where we could catch up without the baggage of being in anyone's home. Mike drove down from Portland when he could, and we talked about his kids, my job, their community service work, and carefully avoided politics entirely. "You know what's funny?" Mom said during one of these dinners. "I can't even remember what we were so angry about anymore. The election that broke us apart seems so unimportant now." "It felt important at the time," Dad said. "But you're right, looking back, it seems stupid to have thrown away family over something so temporary." I thought about that conversation a lot over the following weeks. They were right that elections are temporary, but the fear and anger that had driven our fight hadn't disappeared. We'd just learned to manage it better, to prioritize relationship over being right, to choose love over ideology. The community service requirement ended up being transformative for both of them. Dad was assigned to help with tax preparation for low-income families, work that gave him a sense of purpose and connected him with people struggling financially. Mom worked at a food bank, packaging meals for families who couldn't afford groceries. "It's humbling," Dad told me one evening. "Helping people who are in the same situation we were in, financially speaking, makes you realize how easy it is to end up desperate enough to make bad choices." Their perspective on social safety net programs changed dramatically through this experience. Dad, who had once ranted about welfare fraud and people taking advantage of the system, now talked about the complexity of poverty and the importance of helping struggling families. Mom, who had opposed food stamp programs, now understood how quickly circumstances could change and leave hard-working people in need of assistance. The changes in their political views were gradual and organic, born from personal experience, rather than arguments or lectures from me. They began questioning some of the more extreme positions they'd held, not because I'd convinced them they were wrong, but because they'd seen different perspectives through their community service work. A year after the accident, Dad called me at work with news that surprised me. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Your mom and I are thinking about changing our party registration." "Really? Why?" "We've been talking about it for months. Some of the things we used to believe, some of the people we used to support, they don't seem right anymore. We're not sure what we believe politically, but we know it's not what we believed before." It was a remarkable transformation, and I was careful not to make a big deal about it. The last thing I wanted was to make them feel like I'd been right all along, or that their change of heart was somehow a victory for my side.
This wasn't about winning or losing political arguments. This was about growth, about learning, about people being willing to reconsider their positions when presented with new information. The insurance fraud scandal had one unexpected positive outcome. Several extended family members, aunts and uncles and cousins who had taken my parents' side during our political estrangement, reached out to apologize and rebuild relationships with me. The family gatherings that had been awkward for years became enjoyable again, as we all agreed to focus on family connection rather than political division. 2 years after the accident, my parents had completed their probation and community service requirements. They were financially stable again, living within their means in their smaller apartment and managing their money carefully. Most importantly, we had rebuilt our relationship on a foundation that was stronger than before. We still don't agree on everything politically, but we've learned to discuss our differences respectfully rather than letting them destroy our family. We focus on shared values like honesty, integrity, compassion, and taking care of each other, and we try to find political candidates and positions that reflect those values rather than mindlessly supporting party lines. The accident that nearly killed them ended up saving our family in ways I never could have imagined. It forced us to confront what really mattered, to let go of pride and stubbornness, and to choose love over ideology. It taught us that people are more important than politics, that family relationships are more valuable than being right, and that forgiveness and second chances are worth fighting for. Last month, Dad called me with exciting news. He'd been offered a part-time job helping seniors navigate Medicare and insurance options, work that would allow him to use his experience with insurance issues to help other people avoid the mistakes he'd made. Mom had been asked to coordinate volunteers at the food bank where she'd been serving. "We're not trying to make up for what we did," Dad explained. "You can't undo fraud by doing good deeds later, but maybe we can prevent other families from going through what we went through, both financially and personally." Looking back on everything that happened, I'm struck by how a crisis that could have destroyed us completely ended up making us stronger. The accident was traumatic, the legal issues were stressful, and the financial consequences were severe. But going through it together, supporting each other despite our differences, and choosing to prioritize family over politics ultimately saved relationships that I thought were lost forever. I still don't know if I handled everything perfectly. Maybe I should have pushed back harder when they were committing fraud. Maybe I should have reached out sooner after our fight instead of waiting for them to make the first move. Maybe there were things I could have done differently that would have prevented some of the pain we all experienced. But I do know that when my parents needed me most, I was there. When their insurance company called looking for their emergency contact, I didn't hang up. When they were facing criminal charges and financial ruin, I didn't walk away. And when they were ready to rebuild our relationship, I was willing to meet them halfway. The woman who answered that phone call at 2 a.m., asking about emergency contacts, made a choice to stay connected to parents who had disowned her. That choice led to hospital vigils, legal battles, financial sacrifices, and ultimately to a stronger family than we'd ever had before. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who need us most. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about excusing bad behavior, but about choosing love over resentment, and sometimes the worst crises in our lives become the catalysts for the most important growth and healing. What do you think? When family cuts you off over politics, but life forces you back together, how do you balance accountability with compassion? How do you rebuild trust while still protecting yourself from future hurt? Let me know in the comments. 3 years have passed since that night in the hospital when everything changed. I'm sitting in my parents' small apartment, helping Mom organize tax documents for their new financial advisor, when she shows me something that stops me cold.
It's a newspaper clipping from last month, an article about a local family who lost their home after the father was caught filing false insurance claims. Mom has highlighted several passages and written notes in the margins. I've been thinking about reaching out to them, she says quietly. The family in this article, I know what they're going through, and I thought maybe I could help. Help how? Share our story. Let them know they're not alone, that there's a way through this without destroying everything. She pauses, looking embarrassed. I know it sounds presumptuous. Who am I to give advice when I made the same mistakes? Mom, I think that makes you exactly the right person to give advice. That conversation led to something none of us expected. Mom started volunteering with a nonprofit organization that helps families navigate financial crises and legal troubles. She began speaking at community centers and churches, sharing our family's story and offering practical guidance to people facing similar situations. Dad joined her after a few months, focusing on the financial literacy aspect. Together they developed a presentation called When Desperation Leads to Bad Choices, that they now give regularly throughout the state. They don't sugarcoat what they did or minimize the consequences, but they offer hope that families can survive even devastating mistakes. We're not trying to be heroes. Dad explained to me after their first presentation. We're just trying to make sure other families don't go through what we put you and Mike through. The work has been healing for all of us in unexpected ways. Watching my parents take responsibility, not just legally but personally, seeing them use their worst mistakes to help other people, has given me a different perspective on forgiveness and redemption. But the most surprising development came 6 months ago, when Mom called me with an unusual request. Sarah, there's something I need to ask you, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. What is it? The nonprofit wants to hire someone part-time to help coordinate the family support services. It would involve working with people in crisis, helping them navigate insurance issues, connecting them with legal resources. The pay isn't much, but it would be meaningful work. I was confused about why she was telling me about a job opening at her volunteer organization. That sounds like important work, Mom. Are you thinking about applying? No, honey, I'm thinking about you applying. The suggestion caught me completely off guard. I had a successful career in accounting, a good salary, benefits, and job security. Why would I consider leaving that for a part-time position at a nonprofit? I know it sounds crazy, Mom continued. But you've seen firsthand what families go through in these situations. You understand the financial complexity, the legal issues, the emotional trauma. You could really make a difference. I told her I'd think about it, but I assumed I'd quickly dismiss the idea and move on. Instead, I found myself thinking about it constantly. I thought about the months I'd spent navigating my parents' crisis, learning about insurance law and fraud investigations, and family court procedures. I thought about how isolating and overwhelming it had been, and how much easier it would have been if someone had been there to guide us through the process. I thought about the other families going through similar crises right now, feeling the same desperation and shame my parents had felt, making the same kinds of destructive choices, or struggling to clean up the aftermath. Maybe Mom was right. Maybe I could help. The decision wasn't easy. Taking a part-time nonprofit job would mean a significant pay cut and giving up the financial security I'd worked years to build. But it would also mean doing work that felt genuinely important, work that connected directly to the most challenging period of my own life. I discussed it with Mike during one of our regular phone calls. His response surprised me. You should do it, he said immediately. Really, you don't think I'm crazy for considering giving up my career? Sarah, I've watched you over the past 3 years. You've been going through the motions at your accounting job, but you've been truly alive when you've been helping Mom and Dad and dealing with their situation. This sounds like work you'd actually care about. He was right. I had been going through the motions at work, showing up and doing my job competently, but without passion or engagement. The work that had energized me, that had made me feel like I was making a real difference, had been helping my family navigate their crisis. I gave my employer 6 weeks' notice and started my new job on a Monday morning in September. The office was small and cluttered, nothing like the sleek accounting firm I'd left behind. But from my first day, I felt more connected to the work than I had in years. My first case was a single mother whose ex-husband had been caught inflating injury claims after a workplace accident. She was facing the possibility of losing custody of her children because of his criminal charges, even though she'd had nothing to do with the fraud. I spent weeks helping her navigate the legal system, connect with pro bono attorneys, and document her complete ignorance of her ex-husband's activities. The second case was an elderly couple who'd been scammed into filing false claims by someone posing as an insurance adjuster. They'd paid thousands of dollars to this person and filed claims they didn't understand, only to discover later that they were victims of fraud who were now being charged with fraud themselves. Each case was different, but they all involved families in crisis, facing legal and financial consequences that seemed impossibly overwhelming. In every situation, I found myself drawing on the experience I'd gained during my parents' ordeal, using practical knowledge I'd never wanted to acquire, but that now felt invaluable. The work was emotionally demanding in ways my previous job had never been. I dealt with people at their lowest points, families torn apart by financial pressure and legal troubles, children caught in the middle of situations they couldn't understand or control. Some days I went home exhausted and wondering if I was making any real difference. But there were also breakthrough moments that made everything worthwhile. The single mother regained custody of her children after we proved she wasn't involved in the fraud. The elderly couple's charges were dropped when we documented their victimization. A young couple avoided criminal charges by entering a diversion program we helped them find. My parents continued their volunteer work and their own presentations, and sometimes our paths would cross at conferences or community events. It was strange and wonderful to find ourselves working in related fields, united by shared experience rather than divided by political differences. 6 months into the new job, I was asked to speak at a statewide conference about insurance fraud and family crisis intervention. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of social workers, attorneys and law enforcement officials, I realized how much my life had changed. 3 years ago, I was a tax accountant who knew nothing about insurance fraud, I began. I thought criminal behavior was something that happened to other people, other families. Then my parents were in a serious car accident, and I discovered they'd been filing false insurance claims for months. I told our story, focusing on the practical challenges families face when dealing with fraud investigations, and the emotional toll of watching loved ones face criminal charges. I talked about the importance of early intervention, competent legal representation, and family support systems that don't crumble under pressure. The most important thing I learned, I concluded, is that people who commit insurance fraud aren't monsters. They're usually ordinary people facing extraordinary financial pressure who make terrible choices. They need accountability, but they also need help rebuilding their lives and their relationships. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Several attendees approached me afterward to share their own experiences with family members who'd committed fraud or to ask for resources for current cases. A prosecutor told me she'd never considered the family impact of fraud cases and planned to incorporate some of my suggestions into her approach. That evening, I called my parents to tell them about the conference. "I'm proud of you," Dad said, "not just for the work you're doing, but for the way you've handled everything that happened to our family. You had every right to walk away from us after what we did, but you didn't. You stayed and helped us rebuild. We're family, Dad. That's what family does." "No," he said firmly. "Not all families do that. Some families fall apart when crisis hits. Some people abandon each other when things get hard. You chose to stay and help us fix our mistakes, even when it cost you financially and emotionally. That's not something we'll ever forget." The conversation reminded me of something I'd been thinking about for months. Our family's story had a relatively happy ending. My parents faced consequences for their actions but avoided prison, rebuilt their lives, and emerged with a stronger sense of purpose. We'd repaired our relationships and found ways to use our experience to help others. But not every family is so fortunate. Some don't survive the combination of criminal charges, financial ruin, and emotional trauma. Some relationships can't be rebuilt after trust is broken so completely. Some people never find their way back from the mistakes they make in desperate moments. We were lucky in many ways. We had financial resources to hire a good attorney and cover restitution payments. We had family members willing to sacrifice to help each other. We had parents who were ultimately willing to take responsibility for their actions and children who were willing to forgive. Not everyone has those advantages. That realization has shaped how I approach my work and how I think about my own family's experience. We weren't just fortunate in our outcome, we were privileged in our resources and circumstances. The families I work with now often lack those same advantages, and their paths to recovery are correspondingly more difficult. It's also made me more grateful for the relationships we've rebuilt. My parents and I still don't agree on everything, politically or otherwise. But we've learned to focus on shared values and common ground rather than letting differences divide us. We've discovered that family love is stronger than political ideology when we make the choice to prioritize connection over being right. Last month marked the 4th anniversary of their accident. We spent the day together, not dwelling on the trauma and mistakes of the past, but celebrating how far we'd all come. Mom showed me letters from people who'd attended their presentations and credited our family's story with helping them make better choices or repair damaged relationships. Dad talked about the job satisfaction he gets from his work with seniors, helping them understand Medicare and insurance options so they can make informed decisions rather than falling victim to scams or making desperate choices. I spent 30 years delivering mail, he said. It was honest work, but it didn't change anyone's life. This work matters in a different way. I shared updates about my current cases and the families I was helping navigate their own crises. We talked about the nonprofit's plans to expand services and the possibility of developing a support program specifically for families dealing with white-collar crime charges. Do you ever regret it? Mom asked as we were cleaning up after dinner. Leaving your career to do this work? I considered the question seriously. I was making about half what I'd earned as a tax accountant. I had less job security, fewer benefits, and more emotional stress. By most conventional measures, I'd taken a significant step backward in my career. No, I said, without hesitation, I don't regret it at all. And I meant it. The work I do now feels connected to something larger than myself, to my family's experience and to the experiences of countless other families facing similar crises. Every family I help successfully navigate fraud charges or insurance disputes feels like a small victory, not just for them, but for the idea that people can recover from their worst mistakes. Our story isn't unique in its elements. Families are torn apart by political differences every day. People commit insurance fraud when financial pressure overwhelms their judgment. Parents and children become estranged over ideological disagreements that seem impossibly important at the time. What might be unique is how we chose to respond when crisis forced us back together. Instead of letting resentment and blame destroy us completely, we found ways to support each other despite our differences. Instead of wallowing in shame and regret, my parents found ways to use their mistakes to help other people avoid similar pitfalls. The phone call from the insurance company that night 4 years ago, asking if I wanted to be removed as their emergency contact, presented me with a choice. I could have said yes, cutting the last legal tie between me and the parents who'd disowned me. Instead I said no, keeping that connection intact without knowing what it might lead to. That choice to remain connected, despite the pain and anger between us, opened the door for everything that followed. It meant I was there when they needed me most, present for their crisis in a way that allowed us to rebuild rather than simply survive. I don't know if every family can recover from the kind of damage ours experienced. I don't know if forgiveness and rebuilding are always possible or always advisable, but I know that sometimes the people who hurt us most deeply are also the ones who need our help most desperately, and that choosing connection over separation can lead to healing none of us thought possible. The insurance company probably didn't know they were asking such an important question when they called that night. They were just updating their records, making sure their emergency contact information was current. But sometimes the smallest choices, the ones that seem routine and insignificant, end up determining the entire course of our lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.